Howdy and good evening to everybody out there. All right, so Alex, good evening. I made you co-host. I'll introduce you. We'll go forward. I'll jockey these mute buttons on the various participants. They're usually pretty good about managing it on their own. They're very well seasoned, but you know, there are snafus like last week when my wife accidentally hit the mute button and came unmuted at a funny time when they were playing hide and seek upstairs. She's like, "Where is everybody?" So we had a good laugh, and then we cut it out for the post production for the final cut. Do you have any questions before we get rolling?
I do not, nope. Except I need to figure out how to share my screen, which I think I've got it. Let's see.
If you're using it, are you on a PC or Mac?
I'm on a PC.
So at the bottom there's a control screen. It's a little square icon with an arrow that goes up. It's a share screen. I think that's how it works.
Let's see.
It's
here we go. Yep.
There you go.
Screen one. Okay.
I see Tragedy and Hope on your shelf too. We might have to have you back just to talk about books on your shelf.
Yeah, this is just a small part of my collection. Luckily, the hurricane didn't blow them away. But thanks everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be able to talk with you all about this. Education is really my passion and has been for a long time. So I'm going to get this PowerPoint presentation started. And what I hope to accomplish, what Richard asked me to do, was to talk a little bit about Common Core. And excuse me for one second. And of course, Common Core is just one very minute part of this problem that we're dealing with. And I think the purpose of going over all of this with you all is just so that we all have an understanding of just what we've been subjected to. I know not all of you are in the United States. I know I heard somebody a moment ago saying you're in Australia. This is actually very similar to what's going on all over the world. And as we'll see as we get deeper into this presentation, this dumbing down that's taking place in the United States under the name Common Core is actually happening all over the world. This is a global phenomenon. They fully intend to handicap every last child on the planet, and they've said so. So I want to kind of give you guys an overview of what they've done to us, because I think the first step to, say, unbrainwashing yourself is realizing that we've been brainwashed in the first place, right? And I'll be the first to admit, man, I was super brainwashed. I was more brainwashed than one could possibly imagine. And, by conventional standards, I actually received a phenomenal education, and yet it was very heavy on the brainwashing. And so I want to go over with you guys a little bit about what's happening in the schools. We'll start with Common Core and branch out from there, but so that you all get a good understanding of what's happening. And I think I'm sharing the wrong screen now. So give me 1 second, guys, because I'm not sharing the screen that has the actual, here we go. I'm going to share screen 2.
And then the only other thing is if during the slides, Alex, you're talking for an extended time, go ahead and stop the screen sharing so people can see you full screen.
Oh, okay. Very good.
If you want to.
Thank you for that, Richard.
No problem.
So do you guys all see the screen right now, Saving Our Freedoms, Rescuing Our Children? Does everybody see that? Richard, do you see that?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's all very good, and the voice is very good too, very clear. So
fantastic.
Well.
Okay,
I was just going to say, I'm a victim of Common Core as a teacher in Australia, and I'm very aware of how it's all played out and how it all works through the teaching standards and everything. So it'd be good to hear your perspective on it.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And I guess I should start off too. Richard told me that I ought to at least mention it. So just so you guys understand where I'm coming from, I've spent probably the last 10 years looking into these questions. I co-wrote a book with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld. Let me see if I can reach one here so you guys can see. Dr. Sam, or maybe you can't see. Can you guys see me at all you see is the screen?
I see you off to the side and you're small. I don't know how it looks in the final cut. In the final cut, if you're speaking, I think we're still seeing the slides. So go ahead and just click out of the share screen. And then it should remember, once we get the hang of it, it'll go real smooth.
Yeah, excellent. So I'm holding up a book here that I co-wrote with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld. It's called Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. And it was actually an incredibly fortuitous occurrence that I was asked to work on this book, because Dr. Blumenfeld spent about 60 years of his life studying this exact issue. He figured out that American children were being dumbed down. He figured out that they were being handicapped by the millions using reading quackery that I'll explain to you as we go through here. And he decided to dedicate his life to rescuing as many children as possible from illiteracy. And so he passed away a couple years ago, but before he died, he asked me if I would work with him on his final book. He wrote 12 books on education. And obviously it was a huge honor and a pleasure to be able to work with him. We actually dedicated our book to, among others, John Taylor Gatto, who Richard had the opportunity to interview before he passed away, one of the foremost educators in not just the state of New York, but really the world. And he was actually recognized as such repeatedly until he kind of came out and explained how he was such a good teacher, basically by ignoring everything the establishment told him he was supposed to do. And so if you have not had a chance to watch that interview that Richard did, I highly encourage you to do so. So let's talk about Common Core to start with. Now, this was officially brought in under the Obama administration. It was sold to us as a set of standards that were going to make our children ready for college and career. And it all took place very, very quietly at first. Actually, it ran for under the radar for several years. And it didn't really come out into public view until about 2012, 2013, once everything was ready to go, once they had it all in place, once they had already bribed and bludgeoned all the states to jump on board. So obviously this has been a project that had been in the wings for a long time. And a lot of people are surprised to learn that Common Core was not the first set of national standards. So we'll discuss that a little bit as well. But what the Obama administration did, they used a colossal amount of money that they got in the stimulus program. I'm sure some of you guys remember that. There was an economic crisis, and they said we were all doomed and we were going to have martial law unless we gave a ton of money to the federal government to have people smash big rocks into little rocks and, shovel-ready jobs and all that. So Obama took a big part of that money and used it as a slush fund to bribe state governments and local governments into jumping on board with this so-called education program known as Common Core. They pretended like it came out of the states, and it's true the National Governors Association did play some role in it, but really it came out of an organization called Achieve Inc., which was funded by the federal government along with the National Governors Association. The National Governors Association is not states, it's actually an association, a trade association, a lobbying group, and yes, the governors are members, but they get a lot of their money from the federal government. And they all together worked on this project where they were going to create national standards. Now, the first thing you need to know about these national standards is that even the people they themselves chose to serve on their validation committee rejected these standards. And this is incredible. People don't realize that they put together, actually some of the members, I know several of them, I serve on a board with some of them, they described this body as a rubber stamp committee. They were supposed to look at the standards and rubber stamp them and certify that they were good and fine and that they ought to be used everywhere. And so they had two subject matter experts on this committee. The first one, you see her on the screen right now. Her name is Dr. Sandra Stotsky. She's out of the University of Arkansas. Very nice lady. I serve on a board with her. We're both on the board for U.S. Parents Involved in Education, along with James Milgram, who I'll show you in a moment. He was the math expert. But Dr. Sandra Stotsky is the English language expert, the only English language expert who was selected to serve on this Common Core Validation Committee. And we should point out, she actually agrees with the idea of national standards. She supported the idea that students all over America would learn from the same set of standards. What she disagreed with was, as she put it, the fact that Common Core is going to reduce literary study and it's going to reduce the opportunity for kids to develop critical thinking skills. And so what she noticed as she was going through this was that, wait a minute here, we're taking out all the great literature, we're taking out all the great books that have been produced by humanity over the last few thousand years, and we're replacing them with things like Obama's executive orders and EPA regulations on roof insulation. Wait a minute, that's not going to develop a love of reading in children. In fact, that is going to prevent them from developing critical thinking skills. And so she was very alarmed. She said these were written hastily by people who didn't care how poorly they were written. And long story short, she refused to sign off on these standards. She said these standards are terrible. And now she goes across the country testifying in state legislatures about what a disaster this has been and about how we really ought to be getting rid of these standards. Next, we have Dr. Louisa Moats. This is a lady who was actually hired to help write the early literacy standards in Common Core. She also agreed with the idea of national standards, and she was excited to be able to contribute to it. And now she has a PhD in reading, and she has studied reading extensively. And I don't agree with her on most things. In fact, she's a progressive politically. She agrees with national standards. I don't think we ought to have a national set of standards. But we do agree on two things. One, children ought to be able to read. And two, there's really only one way to teach you how to read if you're using an alphabet such as the one we have where letters represent sounds. And that is by teaching children phonics. If you don't teach children phonics, they're not going to learn how to read properly. And we'll go through this in more detail as we move along here. Anyways, she wrote what she thought were good standards. And I would agree with her. The standards that she helped write were pretty good. But what happened was they took out all of what she added in. They replaced it with a bunch of quackery. And I'll show you what they replaced it with as we go on. And basically, I interviewed her a few months ago, and she started speaking out publicly about this now. She was so horrified. She was worried that millions of additional children would end up illiterate. She said this stuff that's in Common Core is not based in reality. It does not reflect how children learn how to read, and it is going to cause a colossal reading crisis to become even more serious. Next, we have Dr. James Milgram. Dr. James Milgram is a mathematician from Stanford University. He was the only math expert who was selected to serve on the Common Core Validation Committee that I mentioned earlier. And these are direct quotes from his criticisms of these standards. He also refused to sign off. He said they're written to reflect very low expectations. They're as non-challenging as possible. They have extremely serious failings. There are actual errors in the math, right? They're neither mathematically correct nor especially clear. This is incredible. And so he refused to sign off, obviously. He looked at this and he said, no, this is terrible. We are not going to do it. And so what they did, these Common Core people, they just simply removed the names of all these experts who refused to put their name on this and just pretended like it was all fine and well. Again, the only two subject matter experts they put on this committee both refused to sign off on these because they were so bad. Now, I want to show you a couple of videos here. Actually, throughout this evening, I'm going to be showing you a few videos just so you can get a sense of what's going on here. Richard, if you guys, for whatever reason, can't hear this or can't see it, let me know. But let's see if we can get this working. Uh-oh. Did it stop?
Yeah, it stopped, but we weren't getting audio anyway.
Oh, you guys aren't getting audio. Okay. I wonder if maybe the audio doesn't share when you're sharing your screen. Okay, well, good to know. Anyways, what he's showing you here, and I'm sorry the audio is not working, is some Common Core math problems. Just unbelievable stuff. You know, probably most of you guys were in school before Common Core started dumbing down the math program. But what he shows you is some of the sample math questions that they're using in Common Core. And he interviews a nuclear engineer who says, what in the world? This makes absolutely no sense. And you know, there's a reason why this is so important. You know, it's bad enough that children would not be able to do math. But when you realize that math is actually a critical component of being able to think, you realize that this problem is actually even a whole lot bigger than it seems at first. Because if you can't do math, you have problems thinking critically, you have problems developing thought, you have problems thinking logically. And so this handicapping of our children in mathematics is actually going to have tremendously negative impacts. And another thing that's interesting, let's see if we can skip to the next slide here. I've got a few videos we won't be able to hear, I guess, so I'll just kind of walk you guys through what they say in them. But the federal government actually funded a study, and this just came out this year. You didn't hear about it almost anywhere. I reported it at my education blog at Freedom Project Media, but almost nobody talked about this. And this federal study, it was produced by the Center on Standards, Alignment, Instruction, and Learning, a very clever little acronym, CSAIL. And what they found was that this Common Core had significant negative effects on children, both in reading and in math. And they found that these negative effects become more serious. They increase over time. So we're only just getting started on how atrocious these standards are. And I'll show you what's happening. The federal government's own data speaks loud and clear about what we're seeing. The same people who brought you Common Core also brought you these pseudoscience standards. They call them next generation science standards. Any of you who are familiar with the term the deep state or the insiders or the establishment, you might be interested to know that the people who came up with Common Core and this next generation science standards, this organization called Achieve Inc., almost to a man, they all came out of these institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations, like the Bilderberg, like the Trilateral Commission, like these weirdo secret societies, Skull and Bones at Yale, the Bohemian Grove out in Northern California. So the people who developed this all come out of this kind of shadowy underworld of self-styled elites that think they're so much better and smarter than the rest of us, and really see it as their duty to rule over the rest of us. I think obviously they don't want critical thinkers who would be able to identify what's going on here and really think for themselves in terms of restoring their freedom, restoring their nation, and so on. So these next generation pseudoscience standards, you might be surprised to learn that in 12 years of so-called science instruction, these children will never once learn about the scientific method. You would think that would be pretty basic, right? If you're going to develop national science standards, you think that might be a starting point, right? Let's talk about the scientific method so we can understand what science actually is. Well, no, the term scientific method is not mentioned once throughout this entire set of standards. What is mentioned over and over and over again is that human activities are causing global warming and we're all doomed unless we give all power and authority to the United Nations. And the idea that there is no God, you came from slime that turned into a monkey that turned into a human over billions of years without any divine intervention at all. As long as you know those things, you will ace all of their national science examinations. If you disagree with those things, you will find yourself in some serious trouble. We also have national history standards, which came about really through the main Common Core. Let's see if we can get to the next slide. And we are already starting to see the incredibly damaging effects of this. I'll show you some of the textbooks that are aligned with these Common Core. One of the people that I'm working with on this project, his name is Dr. Duke Pesta. And I want to show you guys another thing so you know where to get information. I'll go over this at the end, but I know I'm small right now. I'll unshare my screen in a moment. But we did this special report in the New American Magazine called Rescuing Our Children, where we basically break all of this down and much more. Dr. Duke Pesta is one of the people who worked on this project with me. And in addition to running a school, it's called the Freedom Project Academy. It's an online K through 12 school where they use classical model of education. They teach the kids how to read properly, real history, etc. He's also a university professor. He was at Purdue. Now he is actually at the University of Wisconsin. And he's been giving his students a survey over the last 10 years to find out what they know already, what they think. And what he's found is that every single year, the majority of students believe America invented slavery. Of course, if they had learned anything in their history classes, they would have learned that slavery has been ubiquitous throughout human history. In fact, the Egyptians were practicing slavery thousands of years ago. And America was unique, along with Britain, our sister, our cousin country, maybe mother country, if you will, in that we actually ended slavery, not just here, but all over the world. You could still buy and sell slaves legally in Mauritania as recently as 2007. So the idea that America invented slavery is obviously preposterous on its face, and yet most young Americans coming out of the public school system believe that. And so we wonder, why do they want to burn down the country? Why do they want to shred the Constitution that's protected our liberties for over 200 years? Well, because they have no understanding of history. They have no clue where this all came from. All they know is the fake history, the lies that they were taught in school. So the kids learn almost nothing about the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, except that, oh, it was written by dead white guys who owned slaves. And of course, they also learn almost nothing about the history of communism and socialism. If they had learned something about the history of communism and socialism, they wouldn't be socialists. And as we'll see when we get to the polling data, the majority of young Americans today identify as socialists. So this is very problematic for a number of reasons. We also have some of the Common Core aligned history books. This one tells you that the Second Amendment protects the right of the government to have a militia. This one tells you that Trump was an extreme racist and only racist white suburban and rural people voted for him. Here you have the students learning all about Islam. And I have looked through many, many Common Core aligned history textbooks that glorify Islam and talk about how great Islam was. And if they do mention Christianity, it's only to denigrate it, Judaism, etc. Very, very weird things going on. And of course, it's getting weirder. Now, Common Core, a lot of people think of it as just the nationalization of education. And in a sense, it is. But as we'll see, that's really a misconception in a big way. On the one hand, the standards are only one part of this, right? The other part is the data, which I want to talk about in a moment. And the other misconception, we're going to talk about this later this evening, is that this is the nationalization of education. In a sense it is, but even more importantly than the nationalization of education, it is also the globalization of education. So we will get into that in a moment. I want to talk about the data for a moment, because a crucial part of Common Core is the data gathering component. They are now gathering more data on children than you could possibly even imagine. They probably know children better than their parents know the children. They do endless tests. A lot of this happens on the computer, and part of it is academic. You know, they figure out how well you're absorbing the stuff they're teaching you, but part of it is also what they call now social and emotional learning, which is really code language for manipulating children's values, beliefs, and attitudes. And we're going to see some evidence of that in a moment. But what they're doing now, they're giving the children all these different surveys. You know, what do you believe? What are your opinions on this? How does your dad talk to your mom? What kind of food do you have in your refrigerator? Do you smoke? Do you do drugs? Do you think about sex? Are you a homosexual? Do you feel like a woman sometimes? You know, all these different questions. And all of this data is being gathered into these centralized computers that are, of course, in Washington, D.C. and are interoperable with other states, right? So all of this data is now being shared nationally, not just with the government, but also with private corporations, contractors, educational researchers, bureaucrats of all different sorts, different federal agencies, different state agencies, law enforcement agencies, and on and on. Now, some of the technology that they're using to gather this data is actually, you can see it here on this slide. Here, this robot you see, his name is EMAR, and this is a robot. The federal government figured out that children would be more likely to give their mental health data to a robot than they would to a person. So they put $1 million taxpayer dollars into developing this robot here, hoping that children would voluntarily surrender their mental health data, which of course is being collected along with their dental health, you know, their thoughts, their opinions, their nutrition, you know, what kind of food are they eating at home, etc. Over here, you see different technological tools. I actually pulled this image right out of the Department of Education's report on promoting grit and tenacity. And you see here, for example, a facial expression camera. So what this camera does, according to the Department of Education report, is it analyzes the facial expressions of students as they're being exposed to different stimuli, and then records that, analyzes it, processes it through a computer, and determines whether that child needs an intervention. So, you know, hypothetically, let's say they are promoting, say, drag queens today, and they want the children to have a certain attitude toward drag queens. So maybe a drag queen walks in and starts reading a story to the children, and some of the children make a face like, whoa, what is that? You know, why is there a guy in my room dressed as a woman wearing demon horns? I'll show you guys the picture in a moment. And the computer then would analyze the facial expression and say, whoa, this kid does not approve of this. Clearly, there's some kind of problem here. He's not displaying the correct attitude. He doesn't display the correct emotions when he's exposed to the stimulus. And so we need to have an intervention here. Here you also see a posture analysis seat that's supposed to monitor the children's posture. You see a pressure mouse, a wireless skin conductor, and these are just some of the technological tools that are currently in use in various federally funded education programs. Here's another Department of Education report, and of course this is also all tied to Common Core. This one is called Enhancing Teaching and Learning Through Educational Data Mining and Learning Analytics. And there is a lot of bombshells in this report, but this one here really struck me as incredible. They tell you that all this big data they're capturing from these students is going to enable their algorithms to infer the knowledge, intentions, and interests of these students, and it's going to enable these computers to predict the future behavior and interests of these children. So sit there and think about that for a moment. The federal government is now telling us that they are building computer systems and they are gathering data on our children that is supposed to enable their computer systems to predict the future behavior and interests of the children. I'm not a big movie guy, but one of the movies I did see was Minority Report. I'm sure some of you guys have seen that too, where they actually start trying to predict future crimes, right? Pre-crime. And in this age of, you know, hysteria over mass shootings, you know, they've been talking about it openly now. We're going to have to use computers and social media data. And of course, all this data will be part of that to predict who might be a shooter and make sure they are not able to purchase firearms, and you can bet that this will be abused, right? And this is, again, just scratching the surface of what they are telling us. Another thing that's come in, this was even in place before Common Core, although it's being institutionalized now and it's taking place all over the world. They call it values clarification. It's actually a psychotherapy technique. UNESCO has a teacher's manual on this. They think it should be taught all over the world. And they tell you that the purpose is actually to undermine children's belief in moral absolutes. They don't want children to believe in right and wrong. They don't want them to believe that there is an objective right and an objective wrong. Everything should just be shades of gray. And so they have these very manipulative exercises they get the children to do. Some of you probably have experienced this yourselves. I know I experienced it when I was a student at school, and I remember it had a profound effect on me. So what they'll do is they'll tell the kids something like, hey, there's a nuclear bomb just went off and you're all rushing off to the nuclear bomb shelter, and or say a life raft. Maybe there's a life raft and your ship just sank, and there's only space for 8 people in the life raft, but there's actually 9 of you in there right now who survived the shipwreck. Now you have a doctor and a lawyer and an engineer, and who are you going to throw overboard and murder so that the rest of you can survive? And we all know the correct answer is the lawyer, right? Just kidding. Right? Lots of good lawyers out there. I'm just messing around. But what the kids are supposed to think is, wait a minute here. My mom and dad said we shouldn't kill people. The pastor said we shouldn't murder people. I think murdering people is wrong. What they're supposed to think is, well, wait a minute. Here we are in a situation where getting rid of somebody is the only moral solution. Right? And so what do they come away thinking? Well, my mom and dad were wrong. And clearly this idea that it's always wrong to murder people is incorrect. In fact, obviously here the only moral solution is for us to kill someone. And maybe that applies to other things like robbing and raping and pillaging and enslaving and torturing and things like that, right? Maybe there is no right and wrong. Now, if the kids had been critical thinkers, they might have said, well, wait a minute here, do we really need to kill somebody? Why don't we just maybe take turns swimming alongside the life raft, or something like that? Then we don't have to murder anybody with that. But that's not what they're going for, right? What they're going for is to completely deconstruct these children's understanding of right and wrong, of moral absolutes. Now, it is almost self-evident that the children are not getting a real education in the government school system. You don't have to take my word for it. This is the federal government's own data. It shows that over 2/3 of 8th graders are below proficient in math. Just 1/3 of 8th graders are proficient in English. Just 1/4 of seniors are proficient in math, and 1/3 of seniors are proficient in reading. Now, think about these numbers for a minute, right? Teaching reading is not rocket science. I've got some kids at home. I taught them all how to read when they were 5, 6, 7 years old, and in less than 2 months, right? It's really not a difficult thing to do. I did it with almost no effort, and I did it the way people have been teaching reading to children for thousands of years. You teach them what sound or sounds each letter is associated with, and then you teach them how to blend those together, and then they can decode anything that they might come across on a page. And yet, they're telling us, the federal government's own data is telling us that only 1/3 of high school seniors are even proficient in reading. We're not talking about, they've mastered, amazing reading skills. We're talking about basic proficiency in reading. Obviously, we have a problem here. We spend $150,000, $200,000 a year. Kids spend 12 years, maybe 14 years of their life in K through 12 education, and yet they are graduating unable to even read their high school diploma. What this translates into, of course, is illiterate adults. The federal government also has data on this. In 1993, they found that half of American adults could not even read. They split Americans into 5 categories, 1 being completely and totally illiterate, 2 being a functionally illiterate, and then 5 being a very good reader. They found that half of Americans were in the bottom 2 categories. In 2003, again, same result, about half of Americans could not read. In some places like Washington, D.C., the government's own data shows that more than 2/3 of the adult residents of Washington, D.C. are functionally illiterate. And when they looked at this data, they said, oh, wow, we have a problem. I know, let's all go to Cuba, to communist Cuba, to see what they're doing there. And it's a true story. They took the whole school board, the mayor, the superintendent, the leadership of the schools, and they went down to communist Cuba to see what the mass murdering Cuban dictatorship was doing to educate their children. Now, President Ronald Reagan put together a commission back in the early 80s. He had promised he was going to abolish the Department of Education. He never did that. But he did put together this commission, the National Commission on Excellence in Education, and they put out a report in 1983 called The Nation at Risk. If you guys have ever read government reports, you probably realize that they are not typically using inflammatory language or, sensational things. Typically they're pretty boring and reserved, right? Well, this report was explosive. It said that our very future as a nation and as a people is being threatened by this mediocrity taking place in our education system. They said if a foreign power had tried to do this to us, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. And we really should have, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with Charlotte Iserbyt, but she's become a good friend of mine in recent years. We actually dedicated this book here that I mentioned earlier, Crimes of the Educators. In addition to John Taylor Gatto, we dedicated it to Charlotte Iserbyt. These were two people who were at the forefront of exposing the deliberate dumbing down of Americans through the public education system. And she was actually the senior policy advisor on education to the Ronald Reagan administration. And so she took up her post at the Department of Education and came across all these documents, and she realized that, hey, they are deliberately dumbing down our children, and they are conditioning them to accept basically a merger between the United States and the Soviet Union. They're basically turning our schools into replicas of the Soviet schools with the same psychological conditioning, the same indoctrination programs, even the same pedagogy. And this is unacceptable, right? This is America. We're not supposed to be like the Soviet Union. Well, she started leaking these documents to the press. She finally compiled them all in this book you see here, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. If you don't have a copy, I recommend you get it. It will open your eyes. And I wanted to show you guys a video, but I think you're not able to hear it, so we'll skip it. But what she says is that what's happening is the schools, we think we send our children to school to learn how to read, how to write, how to do math. What's really happening is they are having their values, attitudes, and beliefs completely transformed. Now, it's not just Charlotte Iserbyt who says these things. I was going to show you this video here of Shirley McCoon. I mentioned earlier that Common Core was not actually the first round of national standards, right? They had been working on national standards really clear back to the 70s. They started implementing them in the 80s, and they didn't call it that, right? They didn't tell us we're going to have national education standards. But what they did was they put in federal accountability programs where basically the federal government said, hey, we're funding, like 10% of a state's education budget. We want to know that what's happening in these schools is in accord with what we want happening in the schools. And so they started developing these mandatory testing programs that were supposed to test the children on the things that the federal government wanted them to learn. And so what was the effect of that? Well, self-evidently, the states had to start teaching the children what the federal government was testing for. Otherwise, they would fail those federal tests, and then the federal money would dry up and they would be punished. And so they brought in standards through the back door, national standards that way. Clinton was involved in this, right? Then he had the Goals 2000. Then Bush brought in No Child Left Behind, which stepped up the federal accountability programs that brought in national standards. And this Shirley McCoon lady here, whose video I was going to show you, man, I really wish I could share the audio with you guys. I'm tempted to spend a second trying to see if we can share audio. Let's see.
Alex, if you change your sound card, I think it'll work.
Do I have the sound broadcast through something else, you mean? Or
I think there's probably a selection in the sound card to let Zoom take it from your microphone and your speakers.
Oh, see if I can get this to work. All right, Richard, would you tell me if you guys hear this?
Fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue.
Do you guys hear that?
Yeah, we hear it.
Oh, excellent. Okay, fantastic. So good.
Thank you to Susan, because she had texted that to me earlier. I just didn't want to interrupt you with that and, throw you off. But
awesome. Thank you guys very much. So this is Shirley McCoon. She was one of the key people involved in the development of national standards. And this was back in the this speech she gave here was in 1989. She was speaking to the National Governors Association. She was the director of the Mid-Continent Regional Educational Laboratory, which was hired by the Department of Education to work on these national standards. And I want you to listen carefully, guys, to what she is telling all the governors are in attendance at this speech, and I want you to listen to what she's saying.
Fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society. What is happening in America today and what is happening in Kansas and the Great Plains is not simply a chance situation and the usual winds of change. What it amounts to is a total transformation of our society. We have moved into a new era.
So that's why I show these videos, right? So these are the people who brought you national standards saying that we are seeing the total transformation of our society, the total restructuring of our society, as she put it. And here she is now explaining the role of the school.
Fix up these schools.
Here we go.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is and then move back and figure out what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of school.
So the anticipatory socialization, the social change function of schools. Now, I hope you guys listen to what she was saying. She said we have to predict what's going to happen in the future, right? And surely they use their crystal balls to do that, right? They sit there and they read the tea leaves, and so they know what's going to happen in the future. And then they got to prepare your children for that, right? Using the social change function of schools. Now, they have become very, very good at this. In fact, they've got over a century of research into how they do this. Of course, they can't predict the future, right? What they do is they decide, what do we want in the future? What do we want children to believe? What do we want the world to look like? And then how do we prepare the students to accept that? That is really, once you boil it all down, the fundamental purpose of everything we're seeing in the education sphere right now is to prepare children for the future that these maniacs want to bring into existence. And so I want to show you guys a little bit of how that works. Now, you know, your opinion on marriage and homosexuality doesn't concern me at all. What I want to show you is that they were able to completely restructure the American people's views on homosexuality in one generation using the school system and things that were taught in the school system. So I don't know how old the people in the class are. Some of you are probably younger than me. Some of you are probably older than me. But if you were around in the early 1990s, if you had told somebody that within a generation we'd be celebrating homosexual marriages, you would have been absolutely laughed at. You would have been ridiculed. They would have assumed you were a kook, you know, get the guy off to the funny farm. That's crazy talk, right? Not 1 in 100 people would have even considered the idea of a homosexual marriage. It just wasn't on the agenda. Nobody was talking about it. In fact, homosexuality was still a crime at that time in the United States. Sodomy laws were not struck down by the Supreme Court until the early 2000s. And yet, they introduced this documentary into schools all over America. If you were in the schools in the early 1990s, you probably remember these. It's called It's Elementary, talking about gay issues in school. So I want to show you a brief clip of what they showed the children so you get a sense of what happened. Now check this out.
Sexuality. One home compares his kids to the politically correct view of marriage.
There we go.
Let me tell you quickly the background. Today, the law says that if you're the same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges for a few minutes. What I'm going to give each of you is a sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, and that it goes against what a family is. Other people think that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to 2 adults to decide what they want to do. What do you think the answer to these questions are? Should gays be allowed to marry? Should they not?
I don't see why they shouldn't. I don't see why they shouldn't get married. You know, I mean, they love each other. It's just like...
And so what they did, they get these kids thinking in terms, I mean, you heard the guy. Let's be pretend judges. And they completely reframed the question, right? Suddenly it became a question of, hey, these mean old states are discriminating against homosexuals and not allowing them to get married, even though there's 2 people who love each other. Isn't that inappropriate? Shouldn't we pretend judges strike down these discriminatory laws? Now, adults at that time would have viewed that as absolutely ridiculous. And yet, 1 generation later, the pretend judges on the Supreme Court did exactly what they had prepared the younger generation for. They struck down marriage laws in all 50 states. I mean, they couldn't even get that passed on the ballot in California, right? I mean, they couldn't even get a majority in the most progressive, the most left-leaning state in the union to approve this when the people were asked. And so what did they do? They did exactly what they had prepared the children for. They used the pretend judges on the Supreme Court to bring this about. And again, this isn't a discussion about the merits of homosexual marriage or anything like that. The point is, 1 generation is all it takes to completely change a society's viewpoint on a given issue. And so many of the ideas that we have in our head, and it took me well over a decade to kind of go back through everything I was taught as a child and sort out, is that really my opinion, or is that just something they put in my head? Is that just a seed they planted that I didn't even realize they planted? And I think that's a challenge. That's going to be a challenge for all of us. And I still wrestle with this today. I go, through a normal day and I come across something and I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. What I was taught in school that I've always just taken for granted, that's just because I was taught that. What I actually decided about 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago, was, whoa, I've been lied to about so many things. I need to actually go back and re-examine everything that I thought I knew. Everything that I was taught in school is now subject to being questioned. And so I think that's a process that we all need to go through. Now, again, this isn't a commentary on homosexual marriage or anything to do with that. Now I want to show you what they're teaching the children today, right? And if you went to school prior to like 2005, this is going to all sound like absolute crazy talk to you, but it is the reality of what's happening in the schools today. They are teaching the kids that the gas they exhale, carbon dioxide, is a dangerous, toxic pollution that's going to kill us all within 12 years unless we give all power and authority to the United Nations to tax and regulate this gas. Now, from a scientific perspective, and I've spent a decade studying this question, this is absolutely ludicrous. It's asinine. It makes no sense at all. And I've interviewed even a lot of the UN's own scientists. If you go to YouTube, you can see some of my interviews. Every single UN scientist on the UN IPCC who has ever agreed to talk to me on the record has told me clearly the whole thing is an enormous fraud. Human emissions of CO2 do not control the temperature, are not driving any kind of climate change that's going to hurt anybody. If anything, the little tiny contribution of CO2 to the atmosphere is actually a wonderfully beneficial thing. Because again, if you guys went to school prior to 2005, you know that CO2 is not only not pollution, it is an essential life-giving gas, right? There's not a plant on this planet that could survive without CO2. And I actually spoke at a climate summit a couple of years ago with Trump's climate advisor, Dr. Will Happer, and he's been studying this issue for decades. He said plants are designed, is the word he used, designed to live in an atmosphere with 4 to 5 times as much CO2 as we have right now. That's why farmers pump CO2 into their greenhouses, right? And yet, they are teaching our children in school that this gas is actually a toxic pollution and that we need to submit to the UN's global governance if we want to be safe from it. So, of course, the primary tool they're using to bring about this idea is the government school system. The fake media does some of it, but most older adult Americans who, again, got an education prior to the 2000s or even the 1990s recognize that this is crazy. But here's what the UN says about it.
Many schools as possible will follow examples like this, and we will support them in their efforts. Education is a powerful tool to address climate change and to ensure that the rights and needs of people today and tomorrow can be met. Let us use it and get active today.
Yeah, so education is a powerful tool to address climate change, right? I bet the Vikings living in Greenland 1,000 years ago, there was a robust agricultural society existing on Greenland 1,000 years ago, and then the climate started changing. It started getting really, really, really cold. And the pagan Vikings decided, hey, let's sacrifice some children and see if we can get the gods to quit changing the climate, right? That was probably more effective in stopping climate change than education to stop climate change, right? The climate has always changed. The climate will always change, and no amount of child sacrifices, no amount of education is going to make 1 iota worth of difference. Now, I want to show you what this so-called education actually looks like so you get a sense of what they're preparing our children for.
You've heard the reports. The globe's warming. It's our fault, and the consequences will be terrible.
Children are frightened.
I worry. My mom worries. The water might rise and it might flood the whole town.
We won't be able to survive for long.
What are you most worried will happen?
We'll all die.
Are there some people who say this isn't true?
Yes.
Yes.
Might they be right?
No.
How do you know they're not right?
Well, because the earth is getting hotter.
Where do you learn this?
Can't you see? Oh, can't you see? What global warming?
This really reminds me of it's really creepy, right? All they're missing now is the Kool-Aid and like, oh my goodness, it's crazy. But this is happening in Florida, right? It's happening in schools all over the world.
One of the main components after educating the students of global warming is that they're given a letter for their families to sign, and it's This is the congressman or woman. It's for Congress to pass comprehensive climate and energy legislation.
So you get this great certificate that you can take home, and then there's also a list
of things
it goes
on
you
and
can
on,
do at
but
home.
you see here they're turning them into political activists, right? They're convincing them that CO2 is this terrible pollution and that we need to write to our congressman so that he'll let the UN tax this terrible pollution. Now, what do you think the effect of that is going to be? Once you realize that every human activity releases CO2, and I mean every human activity, there's nothing you can do that doesn't release CO2. An average person releases about 2 pounds of CO2 in one day just by breathing, right? Every time you turn on a light switch, CO2. You can't even die without releasing CO2, right? When you die, you decompose and all the CO2 that was in your body gets released back into the atmosphere. And that's a good thing, right? The plants use it for photosynthesis and they release the oxygen back out into the atmosphere. So that's how it works. And yet they are now teaching our children that we need to submit to global governance and global taxes to save us from this pollution. And again, it's all being brought about through the education system, right? And all of us, myself very much included, were the victims of exactly this sort of indoctrination growing up. And so I think it's a challenge for all of us to go back and re-examine everything we thought we knew about everything and say, you know, and some of what we learned is probably true, but it's still worth re-examining in light of the fact that we have been so manipulated. We have been so deceived on so many issues. So a big part of this, you know, social change function of schools now, and I'm sure you guys have noticed, has focused on the sexualization of children, the perversion of children, the confusion of children. I want to show you guys just a couple of things that have been going on here in Florida. We had a male you had a young girl who decided she was actually a boy. And so the administration said, hey, you can go shower and change with the boys before and after PE class. They wouldn't even allow the teachers to warn the boys that a girl was going to be walking into there to change with them. She walked in and literally caught them with their pants down. The boys ran out and said, oh my goodness, there's a girl in here. What do we do? So the male teacher, the male PE teacher, was then ordered to go in there and supervise this. You know, the girl's in there showering or whatever. And the male PE teacher was ordered to go in there and watch all of this. And he said, well, I can't do that. You know, there's a minor, a young underage girl in there naked. And no way. You know, we used to throw people in prison for that. There's no way I'm going in there. Well, the school administration said they were going to fire him. They were going to revoke his teacher's credential. And then we got the emails. Liberty Counsel sued. They were talking about how they were going to make an example of him so that no teacher would ever again dare to resist this. In Minnesota, they took a minor child. The boy decided that he actually felt like a girl. The parents said, absolutely not. You may not have a sex change surgery. Well, the school knew better. You know, this is a child who's underage. This is a child who can't sign a contract. This is a child who can't buy cigarettes. This is a child who can't vote. A child who really is under the responsibility of his parents. Well, the school decided his parents were wrong, so they took this boy to go have his genitals surgically removed. It's a true story. Now, there's a federal lawsuit about it, but obviously the boy's genitals have been removed. They're not coming back. In California, they just adopted a new health education framework where they want to teach 5-year-olds. This is one of the recommended books for 5-year-old children. It's called Who Are You? And they're teaching the kids in this book that we used to believe there was male and female, but now we know gender is actually a spectrum, and you shouldn't be limited to just male or female. They give the kids 15 different examples they can choose from: agender, bigender, trigender, nous trois, free spirit, transgender, all these different things. And of course, you know, if you believe in biology, biology testifies to the fact that there are only male and female, right? Every cell in your body says you're either a man or a woman. And yet they're teaching, and you know, most adult Americans recognize that, and yet they're teaching 5-year-old children that no, science is wrong, biology is wrong, your DNA is wrong, whatever you feel like, that's what you are, and if it involves chopping off your private parts to you know, resemble more closely what you feel like, then that's a good thing, and that's to be encouraged. And that's what they're teaching to children. Here's another thing. You know, this is why I bring the videos, because you can't expect people to believe this stuff just because I'm saying it. So in California, they passed a law mandating the teaching of LGBT history to all children in the public school system. And as part of that, I actually got a hold of the curriculum. A concerned mother sent it to me. You know, they glorify Harvey Milk, who was actually, they talk about him as though he was the first openly homosexual elected public official. What they don't tell the kids was that he was also raping children, some of whom went on to go kill themselves. But as you get deeper in the history of the LGBT, they have in there pedophilia. You know, Greek men used to have sex with young boys, and this is part of the history of the LGBT according to this curriculum. And so a concerned mother actually went to this meeting. This is the assistant superintendent of curricula for one of the school districts in California, and said, why are you teaching my son, why are you teaching my children about pedophilia? Well, this is what the assistant superintendent had to say about that.
Answer me why you're teaching pedophilia in school to ninth graders.
Teaching what?
Pedophilia, pederasty, right here.
Pederasty, as I discussed with you before, twice in my office when you come to view the materials, I've explained to you that this is done because we are talking about historical perspectives of how gender relations and different types of sexual orientations have existed in history. So this is something,
a man and a boy is a sexual orientation.
Something that's occurred in history, and so this is really important for us to include.
So if you listen to what she said right there, there was a number of bombshells right there. First of all, she said that it's important that we teach this because it's something that occurred in history. And then she says it's a sexual orientation. Well, in California and in 26 other states, it's against the law to discriminate based on sexual orientation. And here they are teaching children that pedophilia is a sexual orientation. And so, you know, it may not happen next year, it may not happen 10 years from now, but the logical conclusion of this would be that it's against the law to discriminate against pedophiles running your Sunday school ministry or your school or whatever the case may be. So this is just a sample of some of what's going on in the school system. I'm sure some of you guys have seen this. This is the Drag Queen Story Hour. They celebrate on their website the fact that they're going into kindergartens, first grade classrooms, second grade classrooms all over America. You know, it's a man dressed up as a woman wearing demon horns, reading these LGBT stories to the children and getting them used to this idea. So, you know, the social engineering is a big part of what's happening through Common Core. It's a big part of what's happening through this national and really global education program. We're going to get into the global aspect in just a moment. Now they have actually global sex education standards, which go right along with what we were just talking about. They want 5-year-old children to know about masturbation. This is for the whole world, right? International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education for the entire planet. They say 5-year-olds should learn about masturbation. 5-year-olds should learn about sexual pleasure. You think, why would a 5-year-old need to know about sexual pleasure? You know, unless you're grooming them for something, right? I mean, that's not a question that 5-year-olds need to think about. I have a 5-year-old. 5-year-olds don't think about those things. They play with cars. They play with stuffed animals, right? They don't think about those kinds of things unless they get sexualized by the school system, which now UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, wants to do all over the world. And then they tell you that this is all evidence-based, and their source of evidence is, of course, Planned Parenthood, which has a little bit of a conflict of interest here, right? So it gives you a sense of what's happening. And we need to ask ourselves, you know, has it always been like this? Have half of Americans always been illiterate? Have we always been this dumb, right? And the short answer is not even close, right? John Adams asked, he wrote in a letter to a friend, I'm sorry, that a native of America who can't read or write is as rare as a comet or an earthquake. Thomas Jefferson used to brag that American farmers were the only farmers on the planet who read Homer. Go find yourself a high school senior or even a college student or college graduate and ask them about Homer. 9 times out of 10, you'll hear something like, oh yeah, Homer Simpson, right? They have no idea that we're talking about, you know, the great Greek writer. Now, if you want just a sense of how advanced Americans were 250 years ago almost, go read the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers were written for average, everyday Americans. These were written for regular Americans. These were written for shoemakers and for shopkeepers and for farmers and ranchers and shipbuilders, right? These were not written for PhDs in political science and political history, right? These were written just for your average, everyday American. And today, you would be hard-pressed to find even a college graduate who would be capable of reading that, even in modernized English, right, and understanding it, because there's so many historical references and, you know, ties to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and, you know, this stuff would go right over people's heads. We have a lot of data on early literacy in America. This study from the University of Montana found that by 1795, 90% of Americans could read, almost 100% in places like Boston. This scholar, Joel Perlman at Bard College, found that by the early 1800s, we had almost universal literacy in America, even for women, right? This guy here, DuPont de Nemours, did a very comprehensive national study on the state of education in America back in the early 1800s. He found that not more than 4 in 1,000 young Americans were unable to write legibly, even neatly. I bet there's more than 4 people in this webinar, including me, who cannot write legibly, even neatly, right? And there's certainly not 1,000 of us in here. So you get a sense of just how far we have fallen. And, you know, back then, they didn't have a government school system at all, right? Much less a $1.3 trillion black hole that was just sucking money out of taxpayers to brainwash these kids for 14 years. In fact, most young Americans learned how to read on their farms from their parents using very simple tools like the ones you see here. The New England Primer, which was very, very widely used. You had Noah Webster's Blue Book Speller. Phenomenal, phenomenal resource for teaching reading. And again, this is a process that should take about 2 to 3 months, maybe 4 to 5 months if the child's a little bit slow or a little bit young. Certainly not, 12 years later they graduate from high school and can't read their diploma. Then along came this guy, right? We talk about Common Core, but I think it's important to recognize that the people who created our government school system actually set out with the deliberate goal in mind of doing exactly what has happened. So Horace Mann was really one of the architects of the American public school system. He had gone over to Prussia, which had pioneered government education. And a lot of people struggle to understand this. Before the mid-1800s, the idea that the government would educate people's children was inconceivable to most people, right? Children got basic education on their farm, and then some of them went on to get a little bit of help from tutors or, private school, private academy, and then maybe they would go on to get a college degree if they were going to do something kind of specialized, and yet most of them were far better educated than our people today. And this guy came along. He had gone to Prussia. He saw what they were doing, this government school system, and he really, really liked it. So he brought it back to Massachusetts. He got himself appointed the first ever education secretary of a state of Massachusetts. And he imported this model where basically parents were ordered to submit their children to government education. The children were segregated by age. They were all ordered to do the same thing at the same time. And Horace Mann was pretty clear about what he wanted. He was a proto-socialist. He thought education would equalize all men. He thought it would turn them into good little obedient statists who would do what they were told when they were told by the government. He wanted to get the Bible out of schools, which was a very radical idea at the time. If you look at the history of American education, it is inseparable from the Bible, at least until Horace Mann came along and under the guise of ending sectarianism tried to get that out. It's one of the reasons kids read so well, right? They had to read the King James Bible, and that was, moderately difficult reading, we could say. One of the worst things that Horace Mann did was bring in this whole word method. So I've alluded to this several times during this talk today, and I want to dig into it a little bit deeper now. This whole word method of teaching reading, it was actually developed with the best of intentions. It was developed by a Reverend Golodet, who wanted to teach deaf children how to read. And, we mentioned phonics, right? A T sounds like T and a P sounds like P. Well, when you try to teach that to a deaf child, it becomes very difficult because a deaf child can't hear. So if you tell them a T is a T, that means nothing to them, right? So what this Reverend figured out, he was running a school for deaf children, was that, hey, I could teach children to memorize entire words. Like, if you guys look at this little image here, you see there's a picture of a fish and then a series of squiggly lines underneath that we all know says fish, right? On the next page, you see a picture of a fork, and then underneath that, a series of squiggly lines that means fork. And so instead of teaching the deaf children that the F stands for F, and the I is eh, and the SH is sh, he just said, you know what, memorize this symbol, fish, the word fish, as if it were a single symbol, kind of like Chinese writing. And then when you see that symbol, that word fish, then you know that means fish. Well, for deaf children, that was a big improvement. But for non-deaf children, Horace Mann introduced this into the regular public schools that he had created in Boston. It turned out to be an absolute disaster. Within a few years, they had to remove the entire thing because it was such a disaster. All the headmasters of the schools in Boston got together and they wrote a brilliant essay that my friend Sam Blumenfeld reprinted in a 1973 book he wrote called The New Illiterates. And they wrote that this change proposed by Mr. Mann and others is neither called for nor sustained by sound reasoning. Today, the symptoms that those children were experiencing would be referred to as dyslexia. Right? The children were becoming illiterate. They were becoming reading disabled. They were becoming handicapped, and they were unable to read because we have a phonetic writing system, right? So to try to teach a phonetic writing system using the whole word method, or the look-say method is another term for it, doesn't work, right? A really, really, really smart child can memorize maybe 1,500, 2,000 words if they're smart, and yet we have over 10,000 words in the English alphabet, in the English language. So what happens when you get to a word that the child has not memorized? Well, then they are unable to read it, right? So this whole idea of government schools that was imported to America by Horace Mann, around that time, there was another dynamic duo promoting this idea over in Europe. You know, it had already started in Prussia, and they liked the idea so much. They found a lot of success in what would eventually become Germany, and they wanted to spread this out all across Europe. That was Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They wrote back in 1847 that the education of all children from the moment they can get along without a mother's care should be in state institutions, right? Presto, the origin of government education. And we saw what that did to Germany, right? Within a few generations, these guys were goose-stepping around and putting people in camps and believing all these delusional lies about the glories of government and slavery and racial superiority and all this nonsense. And obviously it didn't end well for the German people, right? And it's not going to end well for us either, unfortunately. And of course it hasn't, right? We're seeing the fruit of that now, and it is cataclysmic. After Horace Mann came this guy, John Dewey. Now, he is almost universally credited today as the founding father of America's public education system. In fairness, I think Horace Mann really deserves a lot of the credit or the blame, you know, as the case may be. But John Dewey really gets really the blame, or the credit, I should say, for developing our public education system. And it's true, he was very, very influential in setting it up. Now, rather than going to Prussia, he went to the Soviet Union, and he loved what was happening there. He wrote these articles in the New Republic talking about how great the Soviet Union was and how the schools were instilling this collectivistic mentality in the children, how great it was. He wanted to turn America into a socialist country. So he kind of seized control of the architecture that Horace Mann had laid out. You know, after Horace Mann was done in Massachusetts, he traveled the country and encouraged other states to develop similar systems and did pass compulsory education laws. And John Dewey came along and with Rockefeller money set about taking control of this system and using it to dumb down the population of the United States and to indoctrinate the population of the United States. We actually reprinted this essay in the book Crimes of the Educators. It's called The Primary Education Fetish. We have it in the appendix because it's so important. What John Dewey said is basically, you know, we spend all this time teaching little children how to read, write, and do math and all these things. That's not really what they need. What they really need is to be properly socialized, right? Maybe we'll worry about reading and that kind of stuff later on. And so he wrote in this essay that change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction, right? So he knew parents, teachers would have a, quote, violent reaction if they saw what these people were up to. And so they said, we got to do it gradually. We got to do it without people noticing. So instead of going to teachers and parents, he went to the Rockefellers. They gave him millions and millions of dollars. First, he set up this experimental school. He tried out his quackery. Oops. Turned out the kids ended up illiterate, unable to tell right from wrong, you know, basically useless and incompetent, but very obedient. He said, aha, that'll be perfect. That's what we ought to do all across America. So the Rockefellers gave him a bunch of money through the General Education Board, one of their philanthropies, and they set about spreading this all across America. John Dewey first got a position at the University of Chicago, which was being funded by the Rockefellers. Then later he moved on to Teachers College at Columbia University, which was probably the nation's premier education college at that time. And this is crazy. He resurrected this whole word quackery that had been so discredited in Boston 60 years earlier. So he actually developed reading primers or primers, things like Dick and Jane. Some of you older people might remember that. See, spot, run, spot, run, right? Where they were basically teaching sight words to the children again, knowing full well that this was going to do irreparable harm to them. Fortunately, in 1955, Rudolph Flesch came along and he wrote this phenomenal book called Why Johnny Can't Read. He wrote in this book that the teaching of reading all over the United States, in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense. Now we have brain scans where they actually can scan the brains of children exposed to this quackery versus children who learned how to read the correct way using phonics. What they found is that the children who learned the quackery actually have visible brain damage. You can see their brains get wired wrong. You can actually see the physical harm that is done in the brains of these children who are being exposed to this quackery. And so back to Common Core, you guys are probably not surprised to learn that under Common Core, children must learn to read sight words, right? What else would they be doing, right? And then, you know, if the parent goes and says, hey, why are you teaching sight words to my children? That's going to damage them irreparably. We've known that since the 1840s. They'll say, oh, no, don't worry. We're going to teach them phonics too. But of course, they teach them the phonics after they teach them the sight words. And so the brains of these children get all scrambled. They develop a reflex whereby they approach words as if the words themselves were symbols rather than a collection of symbols that need to be sounded out and deciphered. And so what happens, the children end up reading disabled, they end up being diagnosed with dyslexia, they end up being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, they get put on drugs, they get their brains scrambled, and you know, you guys know how that story goes, right? Never ends well. This is what it looks like in a classroom, right? They get the words they're supposed to memorize by the end of the month. They even send flashcards home with the children to make the parents complicit in this abominable child abuse. And now UNESCO, the UN's education agency, wants this taught to children all over the world, right? Children should be able to learn a sight vocabulary. So I mentioned that we were going to talk about how this is now a global phenomenon, right? I talked about Common Core not just as the nationalization of education, but as the globalization of education. So I want to spend just a few minutes on this so you get a sense of where this is all going. You know, it's not a mystery. It's not a secret that they've been trying to globalize the education system for a long time. Back in the 1940s, they got together, the governments of the world, and they created the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is really the UN Universal Declaration of Revocable Government-Granted Privileges. And they say that explicitly, right? If you go to Article 29, it says, none of these rights and privileges may ever be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations, right? So it's like, yeah, you have these privileges, but if we don't like the way you're using them, you absolutely don't have them. But they said in Article 26, education must be compulsory and it shall further the activities of the United Nations. So you need a good globalist indoctrination masquerading as an education, otherwise your human rights are being violated. They set up the UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which was actually established, they said, for the purpose of controlling education. And their little motto for a long time was building peace in the minds of men, right? So we're just going to brainwash the children so that they'll submit to globalism, so that once we have a global system and no more nation states, then we'll stop having war, right? That was the thinking behind it. The first Secretary General of this body was Julian Huxley. He said the goal was world government. They put out pamphlets, even back in the 1940s, saying the schools should combat family attitudes. And, you know, in the interest of time, fast forward all the way to 1990, they had all the governments of the world came together in Thailand, and they ratified this Education for All, the Jomtien Declaration, and they said that all children should learn from the same standards of learning. And they also said, and this is quite remarkable, the basic learning content that's required by all human beings is no longer the responsibility of the family or your local school district or your state legislature or even Congress or the Supreme Court. Now it is the responsibility of the United Nations, right? It's a universal human responsibility, a common human responsibility. So what they're really saying is, you know, Robert Mugabe, who passed away yesterday, Kim Jong-un, the rocket man in North Korea, the Castro brothers in Cuba, they all get to decide what is the basic learning content required by all human beings, and then all children must be subjected to those same standards. 10 years later, they got even bolder. They said that governments must implement integrated strategies which recognize the need for changes in attitudes, values, and practices. Here's the head of the UN telling you what is the purpose of education. Check this out.
Education must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
Yeah, so I just got done with a national speaking tour. I gave you know, a talk along these lines in to about 60 times in about 30 states, and almost every place I went, I asked people, hey, how many of you guys, raise your hand, sent your children to school so they would become global citizens? And you know what? Out of all the many, many thousands and thousands of people I spoke to, not a single one raised their hand. So you wonder, where's this guy getting these ideas, right? That the purpose of education is to turn our children into green global citizens. But that's what they say, right? That's what they're telling us. It's not me saying this. It's them saying this. Now, in 2016, they got even bolder. They got a global action plan on education. They said that education should promote the integrated development of the whole person, including their spirituality, for crying out loud. I'll show you what they mean in a moment. And I didn't mention, but John Dewey was actually a very religious man. He wrote a very important religious manifesto called the Humanist Manifesto. And if you read it, he'll tell you what his religion was. His religion was that we reject the Bible, right? The first plank of his religion is that we believe the universe is eternally self-existing and not created, right? So he's telling you right off the bat, he rejects the Bible. He rejects the view of the founding fathers, that it's of America's founding fathers, that it's a self-evident truth that God created us and endowed us with inalienable rights, and that the purpose of government is to protect these rights. John Dewey's religion rejects that view completely. There is no God, therefore there are no God-given rights. Socialism was his religion, and he would very happily tell you so. So if you want to learn about the religion of the guy who created our public school system, just go read the first Humanist Manifesto. He'll tell you exactly what it was. Now, this action plan on education, they told you that education needs to advance global citizenship. Here is the leader of UNESCO up until last year. Her name is Irina Bokova. She's actually a Bulgarian communist. She was the foreign minister for the mass-murdering Bulgarian communist dictatorship there, slaughtered an estimated 250,000 people. It's a true story. This lady hates me with a tremendous passion. She's actually been spreading lies about me in the Bulgarian media for quite some time now because I was exposing her background. So she doesn't like me, but that's okay. She sent out this press release to all the journalists on UNESCO's mailing list. Maybe she didn't realize I was on there. But she said in this press release, we have the collective duty to empower every child on this entire planet, including your kids, with the right values to shape the future as responsible global citizens. You see where this is going? And then they tell you on UNESCO's website, the organization she was running, and this is still there to this day, you can go read it yourself, they say that generally more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who tend to have lower incomes. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. So you wonder why we're just, running on the treadmill, trying to make ends meet, just trying to keep our head above water. They don't want you well educated. They don't want you to make money because that would not be sustainable, right? Then you might drive an SUV, then you might air condition your house, then you might eat a steak, heaven forbid, or take an airplane ride to somewhere, and that would not be sustainable. So we don't want that. This is a board game UNESCO created for children. It's designed for 8 to 10-year-olds. It's in government schools all over the world. They said, what is the best way to fight poverty? The kids have to get the answer right before they can move on to the next question. And the correct answer, according to the UNESCO, is to share the wealth produced in the world, right? And I mean, that worked out so well for Zimbabwe and for Cuba. And I hear Venezuela is doing fantastic right now. Can't even keep the lights on in the capital city, despite having the largest oil reserves on the planet. And so clearly we should just do this on the global level and then everything would be fine, right? That's what they're telling us. Here's UNESCO bragging about what they're doing.
The Education 2030 Agenda is our roadmap to inclusive and quality education for all. UNESCO, the UN specialized agency for education, is leading the global and regional coordination of this ambitious goal, responding to cutting-edge global challenges, supporting countries to build better education systems, and monitoring progress to make sure the world stays on course.
They're monitoring progress to make sure the world stays on course with their educational nightmare, right? And they are. It's nice that they tell us that because that's what they really are doing. But, people look at that and they think, well, that's just for third world countries, right? That doesn't apply to America. Wrong, right? And you don't have to believe me. They will proudly tell you, right? This is Arne Duncan. He spent 7 years serving as Obama's education secretary. Remember, this is the guy who brought you Common Core, right? Coming back full circle to the beginning. This is the guy who imposed Common Core on all 50 states. He gave a speech to UNESCO. The speech is still posted on the Department of Education's website. He said, UNESCO is the global partner of the U.S. government in transforming our children into green global citizens. He quoted a communist terrorist. I won't tell you which one because we'd need another presentation. But he said, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. Did you guys know education was a weapon? Right? Did you know your children were being weaponized to change the world? Oh, well, you better believe it. He also said education is a global public good unconstrained by national boundaries. He said we have to advance the sustainability movement through education. Again, I asked people at my talks, did you guys send your kids to advance the sustainability movement? Is that why you sent them to school? Not a one hand went up at any one of my talks, right? That's not why people send their kids to school, right? People send their kids to school to learn how to read, write, and do math, not to become green global citizens ready to usher in this little new world order. Arnie Duncan also told us that the U.S. government is working to build the science of sustainability into the curriculum, starting in kindergarten, going all the way through the time the kids graduate from high school. And now we get to the real global element of it, right? The UN developed, UNESCO to be specific, developed what they call the World Core Curriculum. And as we'll see, the name, the resemblance with the Common Core is much more than coincidental. So it was developed by this guy here, Robert Mueller. He was the Assistant Secretary General of the UN. He's dead now. But he said that this World Core Curriculum, and you can read it right on UNESCO's website, right? You can go read the outline of this World Core Curriculum. It's right there posted for everyone to see. He said that it's going to build socialist values into our kids. It ought to be taught in every school on earth. So it's like Common Core, but for the world, right? And there's a real bombshell. You know, if you're not a religious person or a spiritual person, you know, just take this for what it's worth. I'd love to hear alternative explanations. But in his teacher's manual, this Robert Mueller, who developed the World Core Curriculum, he put together a teacher's manual. So teachers would be able to teach this, and you can find it at your local library. They probably have some at your local government indoctrination center. And in the teacher's manual, he wrote the foreword. And in the foreword, he says that the underlying philosophy that his education program is based on will be found in the teachings set forth in the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Juval Cool. And, you know, probably 99.9 out of 100 regular people would read right over that and not even think another bit about it, right? Alice Bailey, whatever, Tibetan teacher, okay, that's nice. Well, I'll give you guys a sneak peek at who these people are. Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. A true story, right? They've changed the name now to the Lucius Trust because Lucifer Publishing Company was a little bit creepy for some people. And then this Tibetan teacher, turns out he's not Tibetan, he's not a teacher, he's not even a human being. Alice Bailey claimed to be in communication with these spiritual entities, is how she described them. These ascended masters is the term she used. The chief one being Juval Cool, and they would, in Alice Bailey's telling of it, take over her body and write out these books. Some of them are really, really creepy, right? You ought to check them out if you want to know the underlying philosophy upon which the World Core Curriculum is based. One of them is called Education in the New Age. And in this book, you should get a copy. You can get it at your local library. They'll tell you that world citizenship should be the goal of the enlightened with a world federation and a world brain. Our problem is to attain the kind of overall synthesis that Marxism and neo-scholasticism provide for their followers, but to get this by the freely chosen cooperative methods that John Dewey advocated. And so now we're back full circle to Mr. Dewey, right? The founding father of our public education system. And I really think we should stop calling it a public education system. It's not public and it's not education. It's government indoctrination. So that's what we should call these things. But anyways, that's right from them, right? This is not me saying these things. It's not me telling you that this stuff is insane. It's them admitting that this is what they're doing. Now, in 2015, UNESCO put out this monitoring report about their Education for All agreement, and they bragged that in 1990, when they first signed the Education for All program, there was only 12 countries in the world where they had national assessments based on national standards. And then they said that by 2013, that number had increased to 101. In America, of course, those standards were Common Core. Now, you don't have to take my word for this. Again, this is all out in the open. You can find all of this on your own. Bill Gates, I'm sure you guys know who Bill Gates was, right? He was the guy who created Microsoft. Well, he, in 2004, went over to Europe and signed an agreement with UNESCO on behalf of Microsoft. Now, you can go read this. My late friend Phyllis Schlafly, founder of the Eagle Forum, got a copy of this and posted it on the internet. It was signed in Bill Gates' own hand. You can see this picture here from when it happened. There's Bill Gates shaking hands with the guy who was running UNESCO at the time. I forget how to pronounce his name. But they agreed they were going to create this global master curriculum, a global master syllabus, and global standards. They agreed that Microsoft supports the objectives of UNESCO. And of course, you also know, or you should know, that Bill Gates, aside from U.S. taxpayers, was the primary financier of Common Core. Now, this was not a coincidence, right? Obviously, he sends his own children to a non-Common Core school. In fact, this private school where his kids go, they actually brag that we don't use Common Core, right? So good. He made the right decision. You should make the right decision also. But I want to show you just a quick little video because, you know, it's one thing to see all this and hear all this, but I want to show you this little video created by the people who created Common Core so that you can see where this is all going. And again, remember, these are the people who created Common Core who produced these videos. So watch it very closely.
Up until now, it's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. Is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis As prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too. Now we know how we're doing compared to just about everyone. So even though local communities will still design their own curriculum with the same rules, everybody can compete on the same kind of staircase.
The same rules, right? So American children will learn the same thing as French children, will learn the same thing as Chinese children, will learn the same thing as Angolan children, and we'll all be one big happy family learning from the World Core curriculum. Isn't that cute, right? And that's them speaking, right? That's not me telling you this. Now, they've told us, they've been very clear about the fact that education underpins the advancement of their entire agenda. You know, they got Agenda 21, they got Agenda 2030.
We've signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets. Were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration.
Website. Here's Nancy Pelosi talking about the same thing.
The Earth Summit Environmental Leadership Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action. HCON Res 353 outlines a comprehensive national strategy for sustainable development in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21 to be coordinated under the leadership of a specific office and at the direction of a high-level government official. The resolution also urges...
So anyways, you get the point, right? Republicans, Democrats at the highest levels, they all agree. We need Agenda 21. We need to guide our national policy based on Agenda 21. And now this is why I bring up Agenda 21. You know, they know that older generations of Americans, you know, liberty-loving people, you know, Obama called us bitter clingers, right? We're going to cling to our Bibles and our guns, and how dare we be bitter clingers? They know that they're not going to get older generations of Americans. They know that the crucial tool in their arsenal is going to have to be the children and the brainwashing of our children. So they'll tell you right in Agenda 21, this global agreement that's supposed to completely restructure every element of our lives, that every person on the planet has to implement it, is what they tell you. They say education is going to be critical for promoting sustainable development. Just replace education with indoctrination, and that's exactly right. They say formal and non-formal education are going to be indispensable to changing people's attitudes, and there's going to have to be a lot of attitude changing to make this happen. And that's just the start of it. In Agenda 21, they talk about they need to teach your children spirituality, education, and all the rest of it. Then Agenda 2030, which was adopted much more recently. This was in 2015 by Obama, who brought you Common Core. They tell you that your children are critical agents of change. They're going to use these new goals to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation of a better world. Then they tell you what a better world looks like, right? Goal number 10, you're going to have global socialism, right? It's not enough to just have national socialism anymore. Now we need to reduce inequality, not just within nations, but among nations. We can only do that if the wealth is shared. And then in goal number 4, they tell you how they are going to do it, right? They are going to brainwash your children. Goal number 4 is totally dedicated to education, and they tell you in there that every child on the planet needs to be so, quote-unquote, educated that they will not just submit to sustainable development, they will promote it, right? Here's UNESCO talking about how they're going to do this.
Sustainable development that protects our planet and builds a more inclusive, equal, and peaceful world without education. We can't. Sustainable development begins with education. Put global education first.
Oh yeah, right. So sustainable development begins with education. And so now we can see the fruit of that, right? Here's a Gallup poll. They show 55% of young Americans would rather have socialism. Here, 3/4 of young Americans would rather have the government control their health care. 2/3 of Americans, more than 2/3 of Americans would rather have the government pay for their college, you know, free lunch for everyone, right? We'll just get the money from our money tree. Half of Americans, young Americans, want to live in a socialist country. Almost half want to abolish our border agency. And of course, this is not a new strategy, right? These kids didn't wake up with these attitudes. What happens is they were brainwashed to believe these things. Now, Adolf Hitler was wrong about almost everything, but he was right about one thing. He alone who owns the youth gains the future, right? It is absolutely true. And that was actually the central component of Adolf Hitler's plan. Brainwash the kids. He actually criminalized homeschooling. He became the first world leader in human history to make it a crime for parents to educate their own children. Why do you think he did that? Because he wanted to brainwash the kids, right? Now the Department of Education says parents can be equal partners with the government in the raising of their own children. Hillary Clinton says we need a village to raise the children. She said this 20 years ago. This is what, of course, happens when the government village raises your children. They want to take away people's guns. They want to surrender our sovereignty. They want to get rid of our self-government. They want to get rid of our free speech. They want to burn down the nation. They want to smash the family, and on and on and on, right? And so there is an end destination to all this, right? They're grooming the children for something. I think a lot of you probably have seen some of this, but I just want to just give you a couple quick clips so that you realize that there is a plan here, right? There is a agenda. This isn't just all happening in a vacuum. We didn't suddenly just forget how to educate children. We didn't forget how to teach children how to read. This is all being done very deliberately and very strategically with an end goal in mind. So here's the end goal from George H.W. Bush.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
So there's a lot in there, right? He said, when we are successful, and we will be, right? Completely confident of success. I think the reason why is obvious. They have 87% of our children being brainwashed in government schools all day, every day. Of course they're going to win, right? Of course they're confident, unless we do something about it. And he also told us what the New World Order would look like. A world in which a credible United Nations, right, that's pretty creepy, will use its peacekeeping role. He's talking about their military forces, right, it's Orwellian doublespeak, the guys with the machine guns and the blue helmets who literally rape children by the tens of thousands all over the world with no accountability whatsoever, are going to use the peacekeeping role to bring about the vision of the UN's founders. And that tells you a lot right there too, right? We know who the UN's founders were. On one side of the table, you had Joseph Stalin and his minions, who were some of the worst mass murdering butchers to ever walk on the face of this planet. On the other side, we had our guy, right, Alger Hiss, right, the senior State Department guy. Well, a few years after that, we threw him in prison because we found out he was working for Joseph Stalin. And yet they loved him, right? They made him the first Secretary General of the UN. He ran the conference that came up with the UN Charter. So Bush told us where this is all going, right? And of course, it's not just Bush. Here's the Communist Party leader candidate for 2020.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
Yeah, a new world order, right? So this is the vice president of the guy who brought in Common Core. That's what they're working on. Here's everybody's least favorite rapist.
After 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
All right. See, so they all agree we need a new world order. And the way they intend to bring this new world order about is by brainwashing us, by brainwashing our children, by brainwashing our grandchildren in government indoctrination centers for 12 years at our expense, and basically spitting in our faces and telling us it's raining. So what I've been working on the last 4 months, I just told you guys, I literally just a few days ago got back from a national speaking tour. The last time I saw Richard, I was up in Hartford, Connecticut. We had the Red Pill Expo going on there, and I used that as one of the stops on my speaking tour. But we've developed this magazine here. It's called Rescuing Our Children. If you have been intrigued by what I just shared with you today, I hope you'll go get a copy of this magazine. And if you like the magazine, go back and order 10. Give one to everybody you know who has kids, to opinion molders you know, your congressman, your pastor, the newspaper editor in your town, anybody who has the ability to influence others. We've also got it on DVD for our illiterate friends. We know there's a lot of people out there, and I don't mean that in an offensive way, but there's a lot of people out there who can't read. So we have it on DVD for those people. You can get copies at thenewamerican.com/rescuingourchildren. If you order one, you can use the promo code EDUCATE19, and we'll cover your shipping and handling. If you order more, we won't cover your shipping and handling, but you'll get a discount when you order in bulk. And you can get the DVD in the same place, or you can call this number Monday through Friday during business hours and just tell them what you want, and you can pay right over the phone or with a card or whatever you'd rather do. So We also have all these articles online for free. If you just go to any search engine, type in, Rescuing Our Children, Alex Newman, special report, whatever, you'll find all the articles. We've got, 12 articles in here, just basically breaking down strategically what's going on in the government schools, what the overall agenda is, the dumbing down, the history of how we got here, how it's being globalized, why you should homeschool or put your kids in a private school, make sure they learn how to read properly and all that. And so that's basically what I wanted to share with you guys. I really appreciate Richard having me on to share this information with you. And I think the real takeaway here is, we need to understand that we have all been victims of this, right? We're now several generations deep into this process. And, a lot of us don't even realize it, right? It's been going on for so long. It's become so pervasive that, we just take it for granted that we're all a bunch of morons who don't know anything about anything, right? And the reality is this is not how it should be. We need to go back and examine what we've been taught. We need to go back and think about all the things that we think we know. And, if you have children especially, I just hope and I pray that you'll take something out of this, put it to use, and do anything you can to protect your children from being indoctrinated, from being weaponized against your family, against your freedom, against your country, and against all that. So that's all I have to say, guys. I sure appreciate you listening. Richard, if you want to jump in, if people have questions, I'm happy to stick around for another few minutes if I can help anybody, or if anybody has any specific questions you want to ask. And once again, Richard, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Alex, you did a wonderful job. I've seen your talks before. Oh, I got audio on over here. I'm going to have a little echo. Let me put that over there. Impeccable job. I'm sure there are questions. How long do you have to hang out? I'm sure we could take a couple.
Let's stay till, if people have questions, I'll stick around till, say, 9:45 Central or 10:45 Eastern, if that works.
Cool. I will help you moderate, but right now I'll just say, usually it works well if we just say it's open floor. Who wants to unmute and ask Alex a question?
Great stuff. Absolutely great stuff. Loved it. Learned quite a bit. I thought I was quite knowledgeable over most of those things, but there was a whole heap of new stuff there. I've been Googling away as I did it, and I put the posts of the videos I want to watch in the Discord server. So you've got me taken up for the rest of the weekend.
Awesome. Glad to hear it.
Yeah, and for your context, Alex, Colin Dixon is in Australia. He's a former school teacher. He became a whistleblower and then is representing himself pro se. So they have Common Core in Australia. It's a problem down there, just like it is up here. And yeah, that's where he's coming from.
Awesome.
He's got a great background too.
Thank you, Colin. And if you would, I'd love to be in touch with you, hear about what's going on in Australia. So let's keep in touch after this, huh?
We'll do that. Yeah, I have represented myself in a IRC, which is the Industrial Relations Commission, and I lost the first case where they used the ATSIL standards to prove that I couldn't teach on 9 of the 37 focal points. One of them being differentiation, which is their go-to standard, because they can always prove on an opinion of a principal that you're not differentiating if a student's not doing any work. And I've appealed that to the full bench of the IRC on the 4th of April. That's 5 months ago now, and they haven't handed down a decision, and that's an awfully long time because they know I'm not going to go away, and whatever they hand down, if they hand down a negative response, I'm going to get very vocal about it. And the first commissioner was so over the top in condemning me in his first report, where he believed everything that they said, and I had lots of evidence that they were lying. So there's 3 of the witnesses, I've got good evidence that they perjured themselves under oath.
Oh, wow.
So interesting times. I still expect a negative result, but there's a local academic, Peter Ridd at James Cook University. You've heard about Peter Ridd's case?
I have not,
Peter,
no.
He's a physics professor on the Great Barrier Reef, and he blew the whistle on them, telling the whole world the Great Barrier Reef was dying.
Oh, goodness.
This is not true. This is not true. Anyway, they sacked him for being uncollegial. So they dismissed him. Anyway, he got crowdfunding in Australia, and spent $250,000 defending it in court. And the university spent $1 million trying to beat him and lost on all 17 grounds. Wow. And just this week, they got the decision about 3 months ago. And just this week, they had the next session where he's been awarded $1.2 million in damages. And of course, they're going to appeal that, the university using government money. But he's doing it, speaking tour up and down the coast with the farmers and a lot of people, going out on the reef, taking video of these destroyed reefs that are the reef's in better health than it's ever been at this point in time. Cyclones cause damage, but warming doesn't cause damage. The ocean is not acidic. The bleaching isn't caused by warming, it's caused by sea level rises. And the ocean, the Pacific Ocean goes up and down about a foot every 18 years on a lunar cycle. So when the reefs get exposed every 18 years, the top of the reef goes white for a bit. So there's a whole heap of stuff that's just rubbish. And he's being called out and he's winning in the court system. So it's pretty good.
Wow. Hey, I appreciate you sharing all that. And let's definitely keep in touch, Colin. It's it sounds like you have a really interesting case, and I'd love to hear about what's going on in Australia. So let's plan to keep in touch.
Yeah, I'm happy to share anybody the documents. I've got the transcript of the last one in our case and all that sort of stuff. So if anyone's interested in looking at the bits and pieces, I've sent Richard some of the earlier ones, but the later ones are better.
Awesome.
Anyway, but love your work. Didn't even know you existed, so this is good.
Hey, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yep.
And Alex has a lot more where that came from. He has multiple talks that he's prepared to present, so this is just one of them. And I was like, the first thing I thought when I thought Common Core, I thought Dr. Duke Pesta. And then I thought, I've already seen Alex Newman's presentation, and I can't imagine it being better. I've seen Pesta's presentations over the years, but you hit all the nails on the head. And for a lot of homeschoolers in the students and graduates, I'm sure you comfort them. It's like, hey, that was a smart decision. But there's also people with their kids in public school still. What can you say to them as far as how they can inoculate themselves with, holistic information of the knowledge, factual variety, so that they don't undertake ill ideas and take those forward in life?
Yeah, well, thank you, Richard. It's a really good question. And what I've been urging parents and grandparents all across the country to do is, if there's any way possible, get your children out of the public school system as quickly as you can. It is possible for kids to go through the public school system and come out the other end relatively intact, but their potential will be, the best possible scenario is their potential will be stunted. They'll come out a lot more ignorant than they otherwise could have been, and they may end up with permanent harm. Illiteracy, the reading damage that happens is really catastrophic, and it's very, very difficult to undo once that damage has been done. So if parents have young children who have not yet been exposed to this stuff, and there is no other possible, I've met a couple people in my life who really had no other option. There's one guy who's actually a friend of mine. He went through a nasty divorce, and the court ordered the parents to put the child in a public school. One of them wanted to homeschool, the other wanted public school. The court decided that it would be in the best interest of the child to go to a public school. And so in that case, there was literally no other option. And so what I say then is, first of all, make sure you teach your child how to read using phonics before they're exposed to the quackery in the school system, or it's almost certain that they will be damaged by that. And once you teach them phonics, once they know how to read using phonics, all the sight words in the world are not going to do them any harm, because they already know how to read. You can't undo the learning that has already taken place. And secondly, I think it's essential that parents monitor everything that's going on. So, when that kid gets home from school, it's, what did you learn at school today? Let me see what pages you did in the book today. Let me look at your homework. What did the teacher say? Did you do any weird exercises that made you feel uncomfortable? What did the teacher say about such and such issue? And then you really got to explain to them. I have a friend who has his kids in public school. He basically tells his daughter, don't believe anything they tell you. Right? You have my permission to reject everything you're taught. And there's probably some things that are worth learning from a public school, but as a good rule of thumb, don't believe anything they tell you unless you have, independent verification that that's true. And also, I would urge everybody who's interested in this topic to go back and watch the interviews you did, Richard, with John Taylor Gatto. John Taylor Gatto really was one of the world's premier experts in education. He understood, what makes children tick, what makes them want to learn, and that's how he got such phenomenal results. And so, I really encourage it. It's quite long, right? How many hours was it? Was it like 4 or 5 hours? But amazing
like 5
material.
hours.
It was, yeah. So amazing stuff. And so even if you don't have kids in the system, go back and watch that. It's such important information for everybody to have. And John Taylor Gatto wrote a lot of good books too. They're very well worth the money.
Who's got the next question for Alex Newman?
Hey, Alex, how are you?
Good, Chris. Thank you.
It's Gary.
Gary.
Yeah. So I'm coming in from a different account, but
okay. I
just wanted to thank you for a fantastic presentation. It's really good that we have you here in Autonomy, first and foremost. I'd like to see or hear more about what percentage of parents are actually choosing homeschooling or a classical Christian education system, or just a classical system, teaching a trivium, et cetera, if you have any data on that.
Yeah, excellent question. And in fact, in the expanded version of this talk, I do get into some of that data. As best as we can tell, and the data is kind of incomplete because there's a lot of states where the states don't keep any track of this data. There's at least 10 states that I can think of off the top of my head where there's no record at all of a child being homeschooled. So the government wouldn't even know if there's, 5 or 100,000 homeschoolers in that state. But it seems to be, rough approximation, that about 86 to 87% of children are in public school. You have, and the estimates vary widely on the homeschooling, you have anywhere from, say, 2.5 to maybe 4 million children being homeschooled, which makes up something like 4 to 6% of the school age population. And then the rest of the kids, somewhere between 9 and 10% is typically the estimate, are in private schools. And of those, the vast majority are Christian schools. That includes parochial schools, Catholic schools, and Protestant schools. And they make up the vast majority of the private school students. But, there's a big caveat there. A lot of these self-proclaimed Christian and self-proclaimed Catholic schools are really just carbon copies of the government schools. So, to speak on Catholic schools as one example, about half of the Catholic dioceses in the United States have chosen to use Common Core in their diocese school system. This is a decision made at the diocese level, and about half of them have chosen to use Common Core. And so, well, we've Christianized it. We talk a little bit about Jesus and we say some prayers, and so it's not as bad as, the Common Core they use in the government schools. Well, it's the same thing. Right? It's the exact same thing, same pedagogy, same standards. Just sprinkling in a little bit of Jesus on top doesn't mean these kids are getting a decent education. And so what I tell parents is, you can't just put your child in a private school or a Christian school and assume they're going to be getting a good education. In some cases, they will. On this speaking tour, I've gone through, I've spoken at probably 6 or 8 different private schools, Christian schools, and I've been on tours of some of these schools, and some of them are phenomenal, just amazing things happening there, better than almost any even homeschooling that I've seen. I think homeschooling is typically the gold standard, but some of these private schools I saw were just off the charts amazing. I mean, my wife and I were just blown away with how good the stuff was. Others are just carbon copies of the government school system. In some of these Protestant schools, they're even using government school textbooks, right, that teach the same lies, and they're teaching the kids sight words and all the rest. So I tell parents, you got to do your due diligence. Again, there's a lot of good private schools out there. There's a lot of good homeschool programs out there, and then there are a lot of bad ones. I teach at an online K through 12 school, and I think this is going to actually end up being a bigger phenomenon as we go forward. It's so much more cost effective for children to learn online. I mean, hey, you guys are all learning online right now, right? We're sitting in a webinar. The technology now exists that we don't need to build a massive school building and hire a bunch of janitors and facility supervisors and plumbers to oversee all that. We can do education far more cost effectively using online. So I teach at the Freedom Project Academy. So like I mentioned, it's an online K through 12 school with classical curriculum. And that's one of many options out there. There's now a lot of these online schools that are popping up. So I really encourage parents, get your children out of the public schools, but that's not enough. Then you got to make sure that you're making the right decision about where to put them, that they're using the right program that you're comfortable with, that aligns with your values, that is going to teach your children, using proven methods and proven strategies, that is going to give that child the freedom they need. As John Taylor Gatto emphasized so often and so eloquently, you can't. The kid is not just a sack to be stuffed full of stuff. You got to take the child's personality and their own wishes into account. You got to respect the child and treat them as a human being. So there's a lot that goes into that. Thank you for the question. I wish we had better data, but that the data that I gave you is pretty much the most reliable figures that we have based on my research.
No, that's great. Thank you.
You've got some interesting feedback on Australian data, and the data is quite fake. In Australia, we've got about 3% of the population in schools is Aboriginal, and Aboriginals' attendance is about 50%. And I was teaching in a school up in the north for a while, and I had 55 Aboriginal students in my 10, 11, 12 class, and they were on the books for the whole year as attending the school. I only ever saw 25 of them, so 30 I never met. Mind you, I got there in the end of February, so I was there 4 weeks after the term started, the year started. And then the girls weren't turning up at all, none of them. And the boys turned up on Thursday because on Thursday they played footy. So I was, on average, the boys were attending about one day a week. And there was about 15 boys that were regular attenders, but they had 55 on the list. And that's with the Aboriginals. Now, in the other schools, the normal schools, if you go into the poor areas, the attendance rate is very low. You'd have, in a class of 30, you'd have 10 absent most days. So you'd be a class would have 30 on the books and you'd have 10 in the classroom. And most kids would turn up once a week for just to sort of check in. And if they left during the day, they weren't marked as truant. If they turned up for period one, that was enough. They'd been at school that whole day. I got in trouble on the system because I marked them truant if they weren't there for my lesson. And I got told, no, you can't do that. Did you actually see them leave the school grounds? Look, they might be somewhere in the school, so you have to mark them as just not in the class. But not you can't say truant, they're not there, because that'll upset our stats, our records. So the actual attendance rate in government high schools, I'd say to be overestimated. It'd be, I guess, 20% of kids, this is in the older years, which is 14 years upwards, there'd be about 20% would not be in school. They'd be elsewhere, off doing drugs or something.
Wow, that's wild.
So,
yeah. Well, hey, let's keep in touch, Colin. I want to hear more about your ordeal in Australia. And anyway, hey, guys, thank you so much for having me on the program. I really appreciate it. If anybody has follow-up questions, I'm not hard to find. You can always reach me on social media or by email. And Richard, thank you once again for having me. It's great to be with you. I love what you're doing here with Autonomy, and I wish you all the best of luck. Thank you very much for sitting through this. And again, reach out to me if you have any questions. So.
Right on. Alex, thank you for being such a wonderful special guest. You're obviously very well polished at that presentation and well versed in the knowledge that was distilled and condensed down into it. So thank you for always bringing a professional level job to the situation. I think more people can learn from reading. Oh, so the other thing is, you mentioned the people get the 10-pack of that magazine. That's where I saw it, because we had met at PorkFest, and we, at Red Pill, and we had talked up to Red Pill. But when I was at PorkFest, people were passing out the New American, and I was actually able to read those articles that I just heard about the week before. So I know that's something that's easy for people to do and spread around. And it's a good coffee table discussion, and it also helps your intellectual self-defense when you're trying to articulate your stance and position and hold your ground in a peaceful way, instead of trying to articulate it yourself. Let Alex do the message carrying. It's in the magazine. You hand it to him and say, here's a copy, go read it. Then let's talk. And it's a good focus of conversation for productive and prosperous cognitive liberty. So thank you, Alex.
Hey, thank you so much, Richard. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Thank you all very much, and hopefully we'll keep in touch. Take care, guys.
Right on. And for the rest of the students and graduates online, I'll meet you over in the clubhouse on Discord, and I'll conclude this meeting. Have a great night.